Okay, so we defined biological species concept with this idea that species, that's one species, if the two populations can mate, they can produce viable and fertile offspring. So a reproductive barrier or reproductive isolation is anything that's going to prevent that. It might prevent the actual mating part, or it might produce offspring that are not viable or are not fertile. Um, when two different species do mate, that's called a hybrid. So we're going to see some hybrids can form, but if the hybrid isn't viable, or it's not robust, or it's not fertile itself, then that's going to keep these two species from merging together and keep them isolated as well. So let's jump over here. Okay, I want to draw a picture with you. So let's look at this word zygote. All right. So if you know much about reproductive biology, then you would know what this term means, that a zygote happens when an egg and a sperm fuse together and they produce a fertilized egg, which is now a diploid cell that's going to go ahead and develop into an offspring. So this would be fertilization, is the event that determines a zygote. So we can have barriers that happen before this that we would call pre-zygotic, or even after that we would call post-zygotic. So what can a pre-zygotic barrier, we'll start here, is going to prevent this from ever happening. It's going to keep the sperm and the egg apart. So this could be as simple as habitat, right? You don't live in the same place. Or even if you live in the same geographical location, maybe you live at the bottom of a tree versus the top of a tree. It could be time. Different species mate during different times, so maybe one mates in the morning versus one mates at night, and they're never going to mate at the same time, so they're typically not going to mix. We can see issues with behavior. Specifically in species that have mating calls or mating behaviors where they have to use those to attract the female. A female of a different species is not going to be excited by that mating behavior. Mechanics. So this is talking about the copulatory organs. I'm mostly talking about species that mate internally, kind of like humans do. Where the copulatory organs have to actually physically fit together in order for the sperm to make it to the egg. If they don't fit, they're not going to work. And then the last one is just, are the gametes even viable together, right? Can this egg, when it finds the sperm, actually fuse into a zygote? And some cannot. So there are examples where we'll see that they mate at the same time and the gametes are there and they're mixing, but they don't ever actually fuse. But even sometimes the zygote does form, right? This is going to be our hybrid, if we've got two species here. And so we might have some barriers that happen after the hybrid forms that prevents this from going on. So the questions we have to ask here is the hybrid viable, right? So viable means that it completes development. So it actually goes through the process of development. It hatches from its egg, or it gets, released from its seed. It germinates from the seed, or it's born. And is it robust, right? You can have a baby that's born that dies at 2 months because it was, unviable. So just because it is born doesn't mean it's viable. It has to live to be adult, to be, a robust individual. And even if it's viable, is it fertile? Right? So is this robust individual able to reproduce with either of the parents or maybe with another hybrid to create a third generation? Sometimes we'll see that the original hybrid is fertile and it can create the third generation, but the third generation is not. And so that is going to tie right into this. And so if the series of reproduction doesn't continue throughout the life of all of the hybrids, then it's not considered fertile. let's go back to the slides. Okay, so let's talk about these and give you some examples of each. So here's that word, pre-zygotic, right there. So that just means before a zygote, we're not going to let sperm and egg fuse together. And so this can happen because of different habitats. So up here on the right, I've got the apple maggot fly and the blueberry maggot fly, and they live on different fruits. Those are their different habitats. You're not going to get an apple maggot fly laying eggs on a blueberry because that's just not what they do. And so their habitat, species-specific habitat preferences are going to keep these two species separated, even if the blueberries and the habitats are the blueberries and the apples are in the same field. Temporal isolation. So down here on the bottom left, we've got the eastern spotted skunk and the western spotted skunk. And the western spotted skunk mates in the late summer, but the eastern mates in the late winter. So even though their two habitats overlap, they're not going to mate at the same time. The bottom right, we've got the blue-footed booby, and you can see this is the male, and they do kind of like a mating dance where they lift their feet up and they show them off, and then the females think that's great. But a female from a different bird species, maybe like a peahen, is not going to think that's exciting. She's looking for the peacock feathers and not, blue feet. Mechanical isolation. So here's an example. We've got these two snails trying to mate. And if you can see, one of the snails is got a clockwise spiral shell and the other one spirals counterclockwise. And so because the shells spiral in a different direction, the actual the mating's not going to be able to occur. It's not physically going to meet. And then the fifth one here is these sea urchins. So we've got red sea urchins and purple sea urchins, and they live in the same place. They mate at the same time. They do the same thing. They both release their eggs and sperm into the water column to just mix. So there's no issue with mechanical or behavioral isolation. The way the species stay separate is because the chemicals of the sperm and the eggs from the two different species don't allow them to fuse. So even if a purple urchin sperm meets a red urchin egg and they come in contact, they're not going to fuse and form a hybrid. And that's called gametic isolation. So now let's look at the postzygotic. So these are after the zygote forms. So over here on the right, we've got examples of the hybrids. So they do form a hybrid. So we can have reduced hybrid viability. So this is an example of a salamander hybrid. And the salamander it develops, right? Look, you can tell there it was born, but it's feeble. What happens is this salamander is going to get outcompeted by all of the rest of the salamanders. It's not going to make it to maybe adult. It maybe doesn't live very long. It's fairly frail. So that's reduced hybrid viability. Reduced hybrid fertility means that we make a vigorous hybrid, right? So this is a mule, and a mule is the result of a male donkey and a female horse. But the mule is sterile. It can't mate with donkeys, and it can't mate with the horses, and it can't mate with other mules. Those pairings aren't going to produce a third generation of offspring, and so we call this infertile. Sometimes the hybrid is able to mate with the parents. And so this is an example of hybrid breakdown. The first generation hybrid is fertile and vigorous, and it's able to mate with maybe either of the parent species once. But the third generation, so the next offspring, are either feeble or sterile. And so the mating and the reproduction is going to stop in the third generation. And so this is called hybrid breakdown. Sometimes, like with this wheat plant, if they can't mate with either parents, but they can reproduce asexually on their own, they might actually form their own new species.